Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. We are looking at the uprisings in various parts of our neighborhood, refer to the youth uprisings in Indonesia, most recently, of course, in the Philippines. That was earlier this month. I think Indonesia was last month. Before that, we had the huge regime change in Nepal, and we also had seen uprisings in um, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that saw the regimes there driven out. I have with me Satish Mishra, head of the Arthashastra think tank in Bali, in Indonesia. So, in a sense, he had a ringside view of the uprisings in Jakarta, in Indonesia, that appeared, again, largely driven by young people, driven by social media, appeared leaderless. And the common refrain one tended to hear was about the corruption, incompetence, and so on. What's your reading?
Well, the first thing is that the fact that a number of civic disturbances happen quite close to each other doesn't mean that they're somehow interconnected or there's the same cause. People who like to lump them together simply because it's easy to analyze that way, think of it. But the causes in Indonesia are rather different to what they are in Nepal and what are they different in India, for instance. And the history is different and the actors are different. So I think it's important to look at each case individually and then see whether there are some common features which connect them, rather than simply follow the news cycle and then say, oh, it's because most of the people look young, therefore it's reflecting the grievance of the young or whatever group it is.
So, in that sense, was what happened in Indonesia, was it entirely driven by those perks being given to MPs and others, or was there something far deeper?
No, corruption has always been an issue in Indonesia, and indeed there's no single part of Asia where corruption is not an issue. Indonesia was especially an issue because the democracy is only 20 odd years, 25 years old now.
Yeah.
And because there was specific mechanisms like the Anti-Corruption Commission and so on, which was set up to deal with it. So this was, and for the first time in Indonesia, many senior members of cabinet, judiciary, state-owned enterprise, and so on, ended up in jail. It had never happened before. So corruption was a very lively issue. So of course, when you have members of parliament who are seen to be giving themselves large increases in housing allowance and what have you, and then dancing in front of the cameras to celebrate, where, in a situation where what they have awarded themselves is higher than the minimum wage in Jakarta, then that triggers repugnance and anger and so on and so on. So I think that's how it starts. But then we have to learn from Tunisia, where the vegetable seller burned himself to death. And the trigger, in this case, it was a motorcycle taxi who got killed. And then there are a very large number of motorcycle taxis all over Indonesia. So it's galvanized support. And then, because Indonesia is also very decentralized, it went from one district to another, one province to another, and it ended up with a lot of looting and destruction of public property, as well as the individuals who were involved in the initial, the singing, the dancing, the celebrating, because they had actually got something.
I was wondering, so early in President Prabowo's tenure, all this erupts. So obviously it's been kind of simmering for some time.
Well, I don't see why Prabowo's tenure is so relevant to this. The point is that, the notion of activism and reformasi was there right from the beginning of the end of the Suharto period. But what has happened is that there are also groups of people who were reformistas, if you like, who felt that the economic reform, the political reform didn't go fast enough. That a lot of people, even the previous activists, had joined the system. They had been absorbed, as it were, etc. So there's always a simmering discontent about things like that. But they themselves, the people who are often arguing against it, didn't go into politics. They didn't take the risks that are involved many of them just became sideline observers. So it's a complicated story in Indonesia. But it shouldn't be linked somehow to Prabowo's becoming president. This could have happened under anybody's.
Apart from the immediate gain of getting all those pay hikes and whatnot being rescinded, what was, is there a larger thing behind it? I mean, is there a bigger goal?
Well, I think, two things. One is that the people who were targeted were also people who didn't have much of a political ideology. They were from two minority parties, or mostly people from media who had made a lot of money. And who were out there demonstrating. I mean, if you have a Lamborghini and you have several Mercedes and so on, and one of them even had a statue of Iron Man, right? And there was interesting, and somebody carried the Iron Man away, and it was a poor guy, and he put it in his shack, and then there was all kind of exchange of comments where this Iron Man was complaining that there was no AC and it was setting and the whole place was dirty and so on and so on. So everybody made fun of it because it was such a ridiculous situation. It was such a flaunting of
wealth,
impunity almost. And I think that's what got people that something should be done about it. And then of course, once it's out in the streets, two things happen. A lot of budding activists then also join that. And meaning of activists here is simply people who have a lot of followers or people who have a larger voice and so on. So that's one group. And the second group who joins it are the looters. I mean, remember in New York, even when the lights went off, there was a huge amount of looting. But in Indonesia, lights go off, there's no looting. In this case, there was. But it was targeted towards, a specific area or specific group. So it was not like the whole edifice fell down and Jakarta wasn't torched and, etc. It was not a repeat of 98.
Those are more racial, is it?
No, 98 was because it had the largest fall in the output fall in the whole history. They were growing at about 7% average, and in 1 year it fell by another 13.4%. So altogether almost 21% fall in 1 year. So massive unemployment issues, inflation, all kinds of other issues came in. And then, it also became racial because that's how the system worked.
Philippines.
Yes.
We were talking a little earlier where you said that Philippines is a little different from what we've seen in Indonesia.
It is because the history is different. The whole idea of people's power as a way of changing regimes has been a popular strategy. And this happened several times there. So I think that it's considered a legitimate form of political action. You simply march to the palace and get the occupant out and then put somebody else in, right? But one of the things that's also happened in the Philippines is each new occupant of the presidential palace brings their own brand of illegality and corruption into the picture. Right? And the issue in Asia is not what you do about corruption, which is legitimate, but how much corruption are you prepared to tolerate? A lot of the very extreme reformists keep on talking about zero tolerance of corruption, but there's no such thing as a zero tolerance of corruption. If 10% of whatever budget is corrupted away, you may be able to accept it in particular situations, and you would not in others. But we had never bothered to define that. Is there a level of corruption that we would say, okay, well, just ignore it. It's part of the way the society functions, or part of the way business functions. I mean, lobbying can be seen as corruption.
Yeah.
But how much is justified, how much is not? That's a difficult question on which there's not been much dialogue. And the same with inequality. How much inequality is
okay.
Is okay, right? So we keep on talking as if the goal is to get everything down to zero. And I think that's more academic discussion than real politics.
In the case of both Nepal and Bangladesh, and even Sri Lanka in 2022, we saw the existing regimes being turfed out. So in that case, the scale of the popular uprising was huge.
Yes.
And far more maybe transformational. I don't know. What's your reading?
Well, again, it's very difficult to lump any of these cases together. If you look at Philippines, the scale was not that large compared to previous demonstrations in the Philippines. But it was very much against corruption and impunity and things like that. Whereas in Bangladesh, this has been, under consideration for quite some time. And again, even in Bangladesh, there's been a number of regime change, which is linked to popular, different factions coming and taking to the streets. And then the kind of response has been there before. So I think, again, the story is quite different. And the issue is, what are the factors that we can link together, and what are the facts we have to say? There's no use comparing Bangladesh with Philippines, etc., in any meaningful sense. Of course, if you say we are against inequality, we are against corruption, we are against youth unemployment, who would disagree? But if you then say Bangladesh is very similar to Sri Lanka, or what happened in Sri Lanka is similar to what happened in Indonesia, then I think you are not going to get very useful answers.
But at least in the case of Sri Lanka, the uprising resulted in something, a change of regime, a change of political guard. What they're going to do with it, with the mandate they have, we as yet don't know. In the case of Nepal and Bangladesh, its work is underway. And again, there's uncertainty as to the road ahead. Where do you see these two, panning out? I mean, is the direction, would you say, is more clear in Bangladesh because they've been at it for a little longer?
No, it's not a matter of that. I mean, you can have uncertainty for several decades. There's no limit which says the public is now too tired of uncertainty, so we are not. You can have complete failed states which go on
forever.
Forever. So I think that's not the issue. The issue really is that in Bangladesh, for example, the economy has been doing very well. It's one of the fastest growing in the region. And it's transformed and so on. The issue was also against a matter of the way democracy was being exercised. When you actually have democratic leaders, we then start ignoring all the safeguards or safety rails of democracy, then of course it creates friction. But the one other thing that we never look at in these situations is this whole issue of ethnic politics, religious politics, and so on. Because they are really linked to the whole notion of horizontal inequality. When we look at, we think of inequality as injustice, right? But, one is Elon Musk compared to, the rickshaw driver in Bihar, or the other one is seeing whether, Bihar is actually, or UP, why is it that it's not as rich as Gujarat or Maharashtra? Or why is it that a particular caste group is doing better than others? So this inequality across groups, whether they are regions, whether they are identities, religions, all the research we have suggests that those kinds of factors can lead to violent conflict. And I think a little bit of that you're seeing even in Bangladesh, But also it's the constant political instability, which means that you just see instability as a normal state of affairs. We tend to see civil disturbance, protests as the abnormal,
Yeah.
and peace and stability as a normal,
Yeah.
right? But what happens if you reverse the two? So it's the stability which is then normal. So you could argue that Bangladesh and Philippines or even Sri Lanka, it is their normal state, and and I think the last point about these is that you have to have political parties with some alternative views which are quite clear. If the public believes that it doesn't matter what they say, when they come into power, they'll behave exactly the same, then it really doesn't have a choice.
Yeah.
And I think those are the problems that you have, really. And even if we were to predict that Bangladesh will, have democratic elections, it'll be stable for a while, but whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Pakistan, whether it is even Sri Lanka now or Philippines, whether it's Thailand, much richer country, the basic political legitimacy of a democracy has not been ceded. There have been periods of military rule, periods of democratic elections, semi-democratic elections, etc. A lot of street protests and violence. In Indonesia, also Suharto was brought down by the trigger was the economy, but then there were several thousand people who did go around, burn malls and terrorize the Chinese or whatever.
The Lumpens,
The Lumpens. But it wasn't just the Lumpens also. There were also political parties, but it wasn't because of a particular agenda. They simply wanted to get rid of the military. And essentially, in Indonesia, a remarkable thing is in 20 years, they managed to seed a democracy in which people have faith. Whereas they don't have the same faith in Bangladesh. So ultimately what we come down to, Surya, is a notion of political legitimacy. Otherwise Suharto's government was doing well. I mean, for 4 decades it was giving 7% growth, rice prices were stabilized, gas prices were stabilized, unemployment was not very high, there was law and order, etc., etc. It still collapsed very dramatically. So political legitimacy, I think, is a matter of trust between the rulers and the ruled that becomes very critical. And I think that is the thing that we ought to be looking at. What is it that's eroding trust? And one thing to remember is that we are now focusing on the Generation Z, as if somehow the age is the issue. But why would the age be an issue when your economy is doing well, you're urbanizing, you're able to move out of your villages and be able to migrate, all the kind of things that the older generation would not be able to do. So what is now there is that there's general frustration, and you use social media to broadcast it. And the Gen Z, of course, much smarter at using social media. And they're also using that to raise the number of become influencers, become heard. And so we lock on to the Gen Z. That's only one minor aspect of this whole situation.
This whole thing about these movements being leaderless, driven by social media, is that true? I mean, there must be somebody there, or a group of people.
Well, the point is they're not driven. And the moment you start saying they're driven, it involves assuming that there's a leadership. But usually, when you have a leadership, even in case of terrorist attacks, at some point somebody will take responsibility for it, because they want to use that to advertise something that they have done or some direction that they are following. So here it's not, if you say that it's spontaneous, what does it really imply? It implies is that somebody, maybe the local student leader or whoever it is, throws the first rock, as it were, or burns the first car. And there's so much anger, then everybody gets carried on. I mean, look at what happened in our case in partition. There were people who've been living together forever.
Turned on each other,
who basically just murdered each other. So not the leader was saying you've got to actually go and murder your neighbor. But the environment was such, there was so much pent-up frustration. Question is, what is the causes of the frustration? And I think to some extent, or to a large extent, the cause is whether it's is group differences, ethnicity, economic differences, linguistic differences, the fact that certain people, like your Nippo babies in Nepal, come from a particular group, they don't really deserve something. So it's the idea of injustice across groups, which I think is the key to understanding this. And it's certainly not across Gen Z, because there are rich Gen Z people and poor Gen Z people, and they're not fighting each other. So the moment you start saying Gen Z, then you basically are, evading the real question, it seems to me.
So if you look at Indonesia, where there was this massive uprising for a few days, and then everything went back to normal, has it really solved anything?
Well, it was a very clever way to do something, first of all, what happened was that there was a spontaneous outburst in several cities.
Yeah.
Some of it was fueled by social media, but a lot of it was fueled by the fact that even TV programs were showing these lawmakers dancing, and there was no stopping those kinds of broadcasts and so on. But then, with the way the president handled it, is after giving a little bit of space, actually comes back. He basically canceled his plan to go to Beijing. He appears on stage with every leader of the different parties in parliament. And they collectively announce that the MPs who were involved have been thrown out of their parties, that they've been referred to the Anti-Corruption Commission, that he's prepared to listen to whoever the protesters were and understand what their grievances are. And on top of all that, this finance minister, who was a very internationally respected finance minister, was also thrown out, because she was always a hardliner on budget deficits and so on, whereas many people felt that there should be a more aggressive provision of public goods and so on. There had been. So, but there was the management which was interesting, and nobody, after the given time, everybody just went home, and there no lingering, and there was a lot of resentment that public buses and rail stations and so on were being burned because they were public facilities. They had nothing to do with these lawmakers, etc. So now, in terms of follow-up, until there is an organized movement which simply says, that what the students or whoever it was or the Gojek or the motorcycle taxis and so on, everything they did was correct, and then build on that. There's no way to move this along. And in general, there is not much sympathy, there was sympathy there was anger at the lawmakers, but there was not a huge sympathy for burning down public buildings and so. But I think it's the handling which was very, very effective, and people don't give enough credit. We're so busy looking at the military antecedents of Prabowo to link everything to his presidency, and as if there was no history before Prabowo. And Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was a 4-star military general, which was hit by a lot of corruption in his cabinet. A number of the ministers ended up going to jail, but democracy didn't collapse, and I don't think it's anywhere near doing that in Indonesia. I think we need to give Indonesia a lot of credit for all the things that have happened.
So on that question of democracy, do such mass uprisings represent one element of democracy? Is it a backsliding when you see regime change happen, when you find an interim government taking the kind of decisions or saying things that it shouldn't be? How do you dress that up?
Well, the origins of democracy, when you go back to Athens, basically all the males used to get together, and some would have white stones and some would have black stones, and they would vote, and the decisions would be made. Everybody was a voter in that sense, and every male was a voter. And you go to Switzerland, you still have,
Yeah.
you know. But I think it's wrong to simply think of democracy as elections. You know, I mean, Stalin used to have elections,
Yeah.
right? And even Hitler was there with elected.
So does Kim Jong Un.
Yeah. So elections are a good theater, but there's no democracy without a whole series of procedural rules. You know, the benefit of democracy is that you're supposed to have a peaceful resolution of disagreement. But it doesn't mean that you can, you know, say whatever you want. You can use whatever technique you want to do that. So there are very clearly defined rules, which is why we have constitutions. Where we don't have constitution, like in the UK, written constitutions, we have constitutional precedent and practice over going through the centuries. Right? Now, so if we only thought of democracy as people protesting, then Somalia would be the freest democracy in the world, right? Because everybody's out there killing each other and protesting, and right? And all the failed states would be great democracies because it's full of civil society after all. You know, even your local police, if you were sitting there with 100 of your employees with guns and parading the streets, that's also civil society. So I think there are democratic rules that people have to follow, and one of the things is that in a fair and free election, if you lose, there has to be a peaceful transfer of power, which is often the big problem. And the second thing is that there has to be a rule of law. You know, the law must apply equally to everybody. It's when those things are denied, or those rules of game are not followed, that you have a so-called backsliding democracy. You know, and so the moment you come to power, you put all your ex-opponents into jail. In fact, if you look at anti-corruption, right, all the evidence suggests that the largest number of anti-corruption commissions, laws, and so on were in the Philippines, you know, and Philippines at that time was considered to be, you know, amazingly corrupt, right? So I think it's the rules which are considered to be the safety guard, if you like, of democracy, and you can't separate all of them. You know, they are. So the media is just as important. Ability of people to gather without hindrance is important. Ability to fight elections without being set on by police and so on becomes important. The way you form your cabinet across parties that win and so on. All those rules have to be followed. It's not just looking at how many people are protesting in the street that matters.
Last word on the protests we've been seeing in Ladakh. How do you read them?
Well, again, Ladakh, I think, is the point I was making, is such a different case to the Philippines and all the other ones we have discussed. Because this is really about a constitutional arrangement, if you like, you know, where the big grievance in Ladakh is that they don't want to be a union territory. They really want to be a state, just like any other state, you know. And Kashmir, we were saying, we want to have Kashmir as a state, right? And not as a union territory, and they gave a number of reasons for that. In Ladakh, we're not actually admitting Ladakh as a union territory, and the arguments are, you know, not that clear at the moment. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is there's also the whole ethnic issue in Ladakh, you know, the tribals, the fragile ecosystem, and the feeling that a lot of outsiders will come in and destroy the environment there and destroy the natural resources and so on. So I think those are very longer term kind of issues, structural issues. They're not to do with sort of instant corruption. They're no you know, Nepo babies and all the rest. So again, you know, now the question in Ladakh is, how does the central government actually deal with that protest? And that's a difficult question, because suppose you had in Ladakh a separatist movement brewing, you know, almost any government would try to nip it in the bud, you know, but whether it does it legally, whether it is simply gets the military in and declares martial law or whatever. Those options have been tried in different places where the situation has been much more extreme. But clearly Ladakh is not one of them. So I think it's still evolving. We need to wait and see what happens. But it is a rather special case compared to the Philippines and the rest.
So a lot of ground to cover there and a lot of other issues that come up, but we are at the end of our time and we really need to wind this up. Satish Mishra, great talking to you and getting some perspective on these movements. Of course, the end result appears as fuzzy as ever, but it probably leaves scope for more discussions down the road.
Well, I'll tell you one thing as we finish. It is fuzzy, but at least we are not talking in terms of democracy backsliding, Gen Z suddenly becoming, future leaders of revolutions and things like that. So at least we can get away from these inane generalizations. And that's a good place to start because that allows us to start analyzing this more carefully.
Yeah, good point. Thank you very much, Satish. Great having you again.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you.